It was still dark when the flashing blue and red lights cut through the narrow streets of Beggarsdale. The music had stopped. The laughter was gone. What remained was silence broken only by police radios, low murmurs from shocked neighbors, and the slow, deliberate movements of forensic teams stepping into a small neighborhood tavern. Just hours earlier, this place was ordinary, a legal licensed tavern where people gathered to unwind to escape the pressures of daily life, especially during the festive season. But in the early hours of this Sunday morning, that sense of normalcy was shattered. According to police, as many as 12 gunmen walked into this tavern and opened fire without warning. Bullets tore through the air, striking patrons inside, then followed others outside into parked cars and even onto the road itself. By the time the shooting stopped, 9 people were dead. 10 others were wounded. Some were rushed to the nearest clinic, clinging to life only to die shortly after. Among the victims was a driver simply passing by, caught in a moment that would cost him everything. This was not a targeted dispute. It was not a single argument gone wrong. It was chaos, fast, brutal, and indiscriminate. As the sun rose, forensic officers began collecting bodies, some from inside the tavern, others from vehicles nearby. Shell casings were gathered for ballistic testing. Police confirmed that at least one of the weapons used was an AK-47. And then came the detail that left even seasoned officers shaken after the gunmen fled. They returned, if only briefly, to rob the dead, taking phones and wallets before disappearing into the morning. Around the scene, community members gathered quietly. Many watched from a distance. Few were willing to speak. Fear hangs heavy here, not only fear of crime, but fear of retaliation. People worry about what happens when the cameras leave, when the police lights fade and they are left alone in their homes. So, we are left with a painful question, one that echoes far beyond Beggarsdale. How did a simple night out become a death sentence, and how many more communities must live in silence before something changes? If you believe these stories deserve to be heard, please share this video. And if you have thoughts on what must be done to restore safety and dignity to ordinary lives, leave a comment below. Your voice matters, especially when others are too afraid to speak. What happened in Beggarsdale unfolded with frightening speed. According to police and eyewitness accounts gathered at the scene, the attack began without warning. In the early hours of Sunday morning, while most of the neighborhood was still asleep, a group of armed men arrived at a local tavern. This was not an illegal operation hidden in the shadows. It was a licensed legal establishment, open, familiar, and frequented by people who lived nearby. The gunmen walked straight inside. Almost immediately, they opened fire on the patrons inside the tavern. There was no argument reported, no confrontation that escalated, no warning shots. The bullets came suddenly, tearing through the confined space where people had been standing, sitting, talking, and drinking just moments before. Those inside had little chance to react. Some tried to run, others froze. In seconds, the tavern became a scene of chaos and bloodshed, but the violence did not stop there. As the gunmen moved back outside, they continued firing. A nearby vehicle became their next target. 2 people sitting inside that car were shot at close range. Police later confirmed that those victims had been inside the vehicle when the gunfire erupted, making them among the earliest casualties outside the tavern itself. Their presence there, whether they were about to leave or had just arrived, made no difference. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Moments later, another life was caught in the same storm of bullets. An e-hailing driver, described as an Uber driver by those on the scene, was driving past the area. He was not part of the gathering. He was not entering the tavern. He was simply passing through the neighborhood when he was shot. His death would later be counted among the victims, a grim reminder that this violence did not distinguish between participants and bystanders. By the time the shooting ended, at least 6 people had already been struck by gunfire at the scene. Others lay wounded, bleeding, and crying out for help. In the confusion that followed, some of the injured were rushed to the nearest clinic by residents and emergency services. There was hope, brief and fragile, that medical care might save them. But for several, that hope would not last. 3 of those taken for treatment later died from their injuries, bringing the confirmed death toll to 9. 10 others survived with gunshot wounds, many of them critically injured. As dawn broke, the scale of what had happened began to emerge more clearly. Forensic teams arrived and carefully moved through the area. Inside the tavern, 3 bodies were discovered. Outside, more victims were found near vehicles and along the roadside. Police cordoned off the scene while forensic officers documented every detail: bullet impacts, bloodstains, shell casings, building a timeline of destruction that had lasted only minutes but changed countless lives forever. Investigators confirmed that the attackers were heavily armed. Among the weapons used was an AK-47, a firearm, more commonly associated with war zones than neighborhood streets. Shell casings were collected for ballistic analysis, a process that could later help determine whether the weapons were previously registered stolen or linked to other crimes. At this stage, police confirmed that they were searching for up to 12 suspects. The gunman had fled before officers arrived, disappearing into the surrounding area. Despite the proximity of a police station and despite patrols already operating nearby as part of festive season crime prevention, the attackers were gone by the time law enforcement reached the scene. What remained behind were bodies, shattered glass, and a stunned community trying to understand how an ordinary night had turned into one of the deadliest tavern shootings the area had seen in recent months. As horrifying as the shooting itself was, what happened next pushed the tragedy in Beggarsdale into a darker, more disturbing territory. According to police on the ground, the gunmen did not simply flee after opening fire. As they drove away, something made them hesitate. They turned back. In those brief moments after the bullets stopped and bodies lay motionless on the ground, the attackers returned to the scene, not to help, not to check for survivors. They came back to rob the dead. Phones were taken, wallets were stripped from lifeless bodies, personal belongings, items that carried names, faces, identities were removed before emergency responders could arrive. For police officers and forensic teams, this detail was deeply unsettling. For families searching for loved ones, it would later become a cruel complication. Without phones, there would be no unanswered calls. Without wallets or identification, identifying victims would become slower, more painful, and more uncertain. By the time the sun rose over Beggarsdale, forensic teams were already at work. White-suited officers moved carefully around parked vehicles and into the tavern itself. A pathology van stood nearby as bodies were prepared for removal. One by one, the victims were lifted from the ground, some from inside cars, others from the roadside, while community members watched in silence. This was not just an active crime scene, it was an emotional one. Residents gathered behind police tape, many recognizing faces, clothing, or vehicles. This was a close-knit community. The people who died were not strangers. They were neighbors, friends, regular faces seen at the same shops and streets every week. As the first body was loaded into the pathology van, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations stopped. Some looked away. Others stood frozen, unable to process what they were witnessing. Families of the victims had also begun to arrive. They stayed at a distance, separated from the media and the cameras. Police confirmed that relatives were present, shaken and grieving, but not ready or willing to speak. The shock was still too raw, the loss too sudden. Fear was everywhere. Community members repeatedly told reporters that they were afraid to talk. Even those who may have seen something did not want to speak on camera. Their fear was not abstract. It was immediate and personal. People worried about what would happen once the police left, once the lights went off, and once the media moved on. There was a real belief that those responsible for the shooting could return and that anyone who spoke openly could become the next target. Police understood this fear. That is why they urged residents to come forward anonymously. They emphasized the availability of toll-free numbers and WhatsApp lines, promising confidentiality. Officers explained that identifying even one suspect could help unravel the entire network behind the attack, but fear remained a powerful barrier. Despite the proximity of a nearby police station and despite patrol units already operating in the area as part of festive season crime prevention, the response had come too late to stop the violence. The shooting itself had been swift. The attackers knew exactly how quickly they needed to act and how quickly to disappear. As investigators began opening cases of murder, attempted murder, and business robbery, one thing became painfully clear. Beggarsdale was not dealing with an isolated act of violence. This was part of a broader pattern, one that left communities traumatized, families devastated, and residents trapped between the need for justice and the fear of survival. The climax of this story was not just the gunfire, it was the silence that followed. The silence of witnesses too afraid to speak. The silence of families staring at a pathology van. And the silence of a neighborhood left asking how much longer this kind of violence would be allowed to define their lives. In the hours and days following the shooting, the impact of what happened in Beggarsdale began to spread far beyond the crime scene itself. The bullets may have stopped, but the consequences were only beginning to surface quietly, painfully, and deeply embedded in everyday life. For ordinary residents, daily routines were instantly disrupted. People spoke of avoiding certain streets, closing their shops earlier than usual, and thinking twice before leaving their homes after sunset. Taverns, once seen as social spaces where neighbors gathered, were now viewed with suspicion and fear. Even licensed establishments no longer felt safe. The message many residents absorbed was simple and devastating: if this could happen here, it could happen anywhere. Families of the victims faced a different kind of struggle. With personal belongings stolen from the dead, the process of identifying loved ones became more complicated and emotionally draining. Some relatives waited longer than expected for official confirmation, while others struggled to piece together final moments based on fragments of information. Grief was compounded by confusion and sorrow by anger. Anger not only at the gunman, but at a system that seemed unable to protect the most basic moments of human life. The fear that followed was not irrational. Community members openly expressed concern that speaking out could make them targets. This climate of silence has serious consequences. When witnesses do not feel safe enough to share what they know, investigations slow down. Leads grow cold. Justice becomes harder to reach. Over time, this silence erodes trust, not just between neighbors, but between the public and law enforcement. Politically, incidents like the Beggarsdale shooting place renewed pressure on policing strategies, especially during the festive season. Authorities had already acknowledged heightened risks during this period when alcohol consumption increases and social spaces remain open late into the night. Yet, despite patrols and crime prevention operations nearby, 12 armed men were able to enter, shoot, and leave without immediate arrest. That reality raises uncomfortable questions about response times, intelligence gathering, and the ability of police to deter heavily armed groups. There is also a broader concern about the nature of violence itself. The use of a military-style weapon, such as an AK-47, signals a level of firepower that exceeds ordinary street crime. It points to wider issues: illegal firearms circulation, organized criminal networks, and porous enforcement mechanisms. These are not problems that can be solved by arrests alone. They demand long-term political will, regional cooperation, and sustained investment in both security and social stability. Community leaders and residents alike have begun to ask difficult questions. How many more lives must be lost before preventive measures become effective? Why do similar shootings continue to occur in taverns and social spaces? And how can communities be expected to cooperate with police if fear dominates their daily existence? The Beggarsdale tragedy is not just a criminal case, it is a test of governance. It challenges the state's ability to ensure safety, uphold justice, and restore public confidence. Without meaningful action, the risk is not only that violence will continue, but that communities will retreat further into silence, mistrust, and despair. What happened in Beggarsdale has already reshaped how people live, where they go, and what they fear. The question now is whether it will also reshape how leaders respond, or whether it will become just another chapter in a growing list of tragedies that fade from headlines but never from memory. For viewers watching from the United States and other parts of the world, what happened in Beggarsdale may feel distant at first, a tragedy unfolding in a place many have never visited. Yet the deeper one looks, the more familiar the patterns become. Mass shootings in public or semi-public spaces are no longer confined to one country, one continent, or one political system. They are part of a global crisis of violence, fear, and fractured trust. In America, the setting is often different: a school, a shopping mall, a church, or a concert, but the emotional aftermath feels strikingly similar. Shock, grief, questions without clear answers. Communities asking how such violence could happen again despite warnings, despite laws, despite police presence. Beggarsdale reflects that same painful cycle, only expressed through a local tavern rather than a suburban street. What stands out in this case is the level of weaponry involved. The reported use of an AK-47 immediately raises international concerns. These are not weapons designed for civilian spaces. Their presence points to global networks of illegal arms trafficking routes that cross borders, exploit weak enforcement, and turn local disputes or criminal acts into mass casualty events. This is not just a local policing issue, it is an international security challenge. From a global perspective, the silence of witnesses in Beggarsdale is equally troubling. Fear-driven silence is not unique to one country. In many parts of the world, whether in inner-city neighborhoods, rural towns, or conflict-prone regions, people stay quiet not because they do not care, but because they do not feel protected. When citizens believe that speaking out puts their lives at risk, justice becomes nearly impossible, no matter how advanced the legal system may be. For American viewers, especially older generations who have witnessed decades of social change, this story raises uncomfortable reflections. Communities everywhere seem to be grappling with the same questions. How do we protect public spaces? How do we balance policing with trust? And how do we prevent fear from becoming a permanent feature of daily life? Internationally, incidents like Beggarsdale rarely dominate global headlines unless they involve tourists, political figures, or extraordinary geopolitical consequences. Yet for the families affected, the loss is no less profound. A life lost in a small township carries the same weight as a life lost in a major city. The difference lies only in who is watching. This is why stories like this matter beyond their borders. They remind the world that violence is not isolated and safety is not guaranteed by geography alone. They expose shared vulnerabilities, weak gun control enforcement, limited community protection, and the growing normalization of fear. As the world becomes more interconnected, so too do its crises. The tragedy in Beggarsdale is not just South Africa's problem, it echoes concerns felt in American towns, European cities, and communities across the globe. The question is whether these shared experiences will lead to shared solutions, or whether each society will continue to mourn its losses alone. As night fell again over Beggarsdale, the police tape remained. The tavern stood silent. What had once been a place of music conversation and brief escape from daily hardship was now marked by loss. Its walls bearing memories that would never fade. For the families who lost loved ones, life would never return to what it was before that early Sunday morning. 9 lives were taken, not in a war zone, not in a battlefield, but in a place meant for rest, connection, and community. The numbers may eventually disappear from headlines, but for those left behind, each number carries a name, a face, and a future that will never come. The danger in tragedies like this lies not only in the violence itself, but in what follows afterward: fear, silence, withdrawal. When communities begin to accept fear as normal, violence gains power without firing another shot. When witnesses feel too unsafe to speak, justice slows. And when families grieve alone, society fractures in quiet ways that statistics can never fully capture. What happened in Beggarsdale is a warning not just for one community, but for many others facing similar conditions. It warns of what happens when illegal weapons circulate freely. It warns of what happens when public spaces become battlegrounds. And it warns of the cost of ignoring patterns that repeat themselves: tavern shootings, festive season violence, and communities trapped between celebration and survival. This story also forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How do we protect ordinary people in ordinary places? How do we ensure that speaking up does not become a death sentence? And how do we prevent grief from becoming routine? For viewers watching from the United States and around the world, Beggarsdale may feel far away. But the emotions it exposes, fear, anger, helplessness, and sorrow, are universal. Communities everywhere are asking the same questions, and too often they are receiving the same silence in return. The future of Beggarsdale now depends on what happens next, whether investigations lead to arrests, whether witnesses feel safe enough to come forward, and whether leaders take meaningful steps to prevent this kind of violence from repeating itself, not just in words, but in action. If you believe that these lives deserve more than a passing mention, please share this story. If you believe that silence only protects those who commit violence, leave a comment and join the conversation. And if you believe that truth still matters, especially when fear tries to suppress it, subscribe and stay with us as we continue to follow stories that others may prefer to forget. Because remembering is the first step toward accountability, and accountability is the first step toward change.